This is Psychology Deep Dive podcast with Harry Venice, and today you're going to learn the final step for overcoming trauma. Now, you may wonder why I've said the final step, and that is because there are many steps when it comes to complex trauma and CPTSD. However, even when you do the core steps, and a lot of those involve neuroscience, exposure therapy, taking advantage of the synaptic plasticity of the brain. And that is just a fancy term for remapping, having new associations, and contextualizing the trauma event. All those have to be done. But even when you do that, if you have been through significant trauma, and remember, CPTSD and complex trauma can literally be thousands of events. Coming home and being criticized, having to shut down your body literally every day for years. If you go through that, you may reduce the flashbacks through memory processing. And I've got a book coming out. It's a double PhD length thesis, which is condensing just the practical parts. And doing that hurt the intellectual side of me and all the research I did. But it has to be readable. I'm going to put everything in there, everything you need to know about trauma. Sign up to the newsletter. I might not have the link up by the time this is up, but contact me and you'll get early access to that book. I go through all that, but there's something else, and I mention it in the book, but there's something else you need if there's still the hole in your heart. You can stop the flashbacks, but complex trauma, abuse, there's an injustice to it. For example, for many of us, you can't go to the parent, tell them the violation from a very mature place and have it heard. That leaves a loneliness. That's a problem. And what I'm going to show you through this is you can outgrow the problem. And that's what Jung says. So through my book, I'll address it in my newsletter too. You can get all the steps to healing and addressing trauma. It's very complicated. I simplify it. I'll do some episodes on it too. But there are things like flashbacks. There's parts of the brain. The amygdala is overly working. The hippocampus is not. The prefrontal cortex is not. The mature parts of the brain are not operating in the moment as they should. And then you get auditory, visual, and all other sorts of cues in the current environment that activate, that take you back, and you re-experience. And then you have flashbacks. When you enter therapy, it's very common. All these things are going on. They're things you deal with. I'm not going to go into that today. They're the fundamental steps. But what I'm saying is, even when you do that, you can be left with something. And that's what I'm going to address here. This is really alchemy. What Jung talks about, alchemy. I'm going to quote from Jung now. Jung says he had always worked with the conviction that at the bottom there are no insoluble problems. And what he's saying there is soluble just means solvable. It's just an old school way of saying it. And Jung found with all his patients that they're able to simply outgrow a problem that had destroyed others. The, quote, outgrowing proved to be a new level of consciousness. Some higher or wider interest appeared on the patient's horizon. And through this broadening of his outlook, the insolvable problem lost its urgency. It was not solved logically on its own terms, but faded out when confronted with a new and stronger life urge. It was not repressed and made unconscious, but merely appeared in a different light, and so really did become different. And this is the important part. This isn't about denial. This does not mean that the storm is robbed of its reality, but instead of it being in it, one is above it. One certainly does feel the affect and is shaken and tormented by it. Yet at the same time, one is aware of a higher consciousness looking on, which prevents one from becoming identical with the affect. They can say, I know that I suffer. Jung actually mentions that this tends to happen, rarely happens before the middle of life. Normally between the ages of 35 and 40 it happens. And if you do it too soon, it can actually be injurious, it can be hurtful. And this goes into the classic conversations that come up. You know, can you individuate at a young age? Generally, this sort of business happens later on. A more simplified view is the distractions, the coping mechanisms, they lose their efficiency. A lot of people don't address it, but often there's a crisis of sorts, an emotional crisis. Some people buy a Ferrari and just meet up with their secretary or co-worker and have an affair and don't deal with the problem. But others do the work. And that's what Jung's talking about. And what he's saying is we don't solve it, we outgrow it. We outgrow the problem. And there's this desire, and I had it, and I sometimes still have it, but I've had to work through it. It just doesn't work. It's this concept of there's a problem and I solve it. I've got an issue and I get over it. I overcome it. It doesn't really work like that. Not when you have big griefs, big traumas. There are just some life-changing events. There are some life-changing experiences. And you can contextualize them. But they're a part of you. They're part of your life story. Like Jung says there, you know, the people that he saw in his practice, they didn't act like the storm never happened, but they could see it separately and from above. Now, at the time that Jung wrote this, we did not know what we know about trauma and complex trauma. In fact, Jung, in his theory, was trying to account for things we would call trauma today, but in his own psychology that he created. He, in fact, said that the trauma theory is abandoned because the trauma theory originates with Breuer and Freud. And Joseph Breuer, he wrote from memory, it's Dementia Pro Cox or something, the book. And I've read that book and researched it for my own book, which will be coming out. They explore trauma, but Freud moved away. Breuer, after writing that book, Breuer to me is the real brains behind it, who really got it. Freud went his way, and then Jung, because Jung always tried to create a linear line between theories and adapt and add. And his way was he abandoned the theory. And I've dissected that. I'm not sure if I'll include that in the book I release, the dissection, because it might not be that relevant. It might be another book. But so Jung didn't view trauma like we do now, and he didn't have the data available and the evidence and the research. So what Jung is saying here, that they look at it separately and above it, is genius in this sense. His conclusion reflects what the neuroscience says that we need to do. Because we need to contextualize the trauma event. What happens when a trauma occurs is it's an overwhelming event and the focus narrows. Your hippocampus, which deals with memory and the longer term autobiographical things, like the context of things in your life. In that moment, the amygdala's firing, fight, flight, fear, fight, flight, freeze, or immobility response. It's survival. You got to think of it as like if a lion was about to attack you right now, you're not your priority is not how you're going to contextualize it in 5 years. It's surviving. So it makes sense. The amygdala fires, things sharpen. The hippocampus goes offline, or minimally is operating. We need to contextualize it later on. And that's through exposure therapy, reprocessing the trauma event, which you really need to do with someone professional and trained, because it's serious business, because you re-experience the event. So you shouldn't willy-nilly be doing that. If you want to do one-on-ones, contact me and I can help you with that. But that's what Jung's getting at, because what he's saying is these patients of his contextualized it. They were able to look at it above and down. They weren't identified with it. And that happens when you contextualize a trauma memory. But that requires reprocessing it mentally so that the hippocampus can update and also the prefrontal cortex can be involved. That takes a lot of repetition. Now, neuroscientifically, there's a thing called the dual representation memory system, contextualized representations that we have, and then sensory-based, sensory from the body, not contextualized. Not from the body, but I view them that way. When I do trauma memory processing, I literally visualize them in my body and I move them up to my brain. But anyway, and when we've shut down and we haven't contextualized the trauma event, for example, a father abusively yelling at you or swearing at you, you shut down and you have a vision of their face. When you reprocess the trauma memory, you're trying to get the contextualized representation. You're trying to get context from the hippocampus. It's a lot more technical than this, but I'm just going to give you the general idea. I'll break it down in other videos and episodes. But you're trying to contextualize the event, but you can't, because the hippocampus literally wasn't online. And the prefrontal cortex, they weren't operating. And it gets worse. They were, but I mean at a very diminished level. And it gets worse because it's shown that literally the brain of those with complex trauma has changed. They lose volume and capacity. Volume and shape changes. The hippocampus of someone who experiences trauma and develops CPTSD, if you look at the brain scans, the hippocampus is smaller in size and changed in shape. The same applies to the amygdala. The size, the volume is smaller, and it changes shape. It's impaired. It's not functioning properly. But what do you expect? It was exposed to extreme things and it needed to function differently. The work to be able to see the trauma events, as Jung said of his clients, he didn't have this neuroscience before him. There wasn't this evidence. To be able to see it up and above looking down as having happened to you but not being identified with it. What that really means is to have contextualized the memory, the event. You don't deny it. You actually know it happened very well. But it happened 20 years ago. It's not today. It's not 2025. It's 2005 it happened. And you view it that way. And Jung says they view it from another standpoint. They outgrow it. They don't solve the problem. Now, this is the bit where I say you're not going to get this in clinical manuals, neuroscience. They'll give you what you need to learn on a technical level. But sometimes when you've been through something so horrific, so many times, you have this hole in your heart. It's an injustice. You need this attitude. And that's what I'm saying is the final step. You need to say, I outgrow it. I don't solve it. It is a problem. It was a problem. It is a part of me. It was a problem. That's a better way to put it. I don't solve that. That's fake. That means it didn't happen. That's bullshit. It did happen. But I outgrow the problem. I adapt, because really trauma and secure attachment as well. It's about adaptability. I love what Peter Fonagy said about mentalization. It's really about, and trauma, he said, it's about resilience. That's what all this work we do is. And to be able to view your trauma as something you've outgrown requires resilience. It means that you've gone through the trauma memory processing. That process is brutal, mate, especially depending what you've been through. I've done it. It was unbelievable. And you couldn't really find, quite frankly, couldn't find someone really qualified to know how to do the process. The only people that actually knew the neuroscience and how it's not just the neuroscience, well, it links, but were psychology based, but knew how trauma memory worked. They were professors, literally world-class professors, and I'd done training with them. That's a very small pool of individuals. So I had to do a lot of it on my own while I'm doing my therapy, personal therapy. I've done an analysis and lots of hours. It's 300 plus hours. But I knew I had to take control of this thing and do it. And what Jung's saying is really that it's context. And the reality is you have to process the trauma events and the flashbacks. You first want flashbacks to go away because they're involuntary. They're not properly... Flashbacks occur because the hippocampus hasn't properly contextualized the memory, so it keeps coming back. So, yeah, I wanted to make that link that's what Jung's getting at, but you need this attitude that it's not a solved problem. That is a trap. From the bottom of my heart, I tell you it's a trap. To think it's a solved problem is a trap. Trauma is not a deep, deep trauma, a deep grief, even just a deep traumatic loss of someone you love. It's not a problem that's solved. It is a problem. It's something problematic and hurtful that happened, and you outgrew it. You adapt. I'm going to read some more Jung. There are no solvable problems. We simply outgrow them. The patients who could do this would, quote, outgrow problems that destroyed others. This outgrowing was actually, quote, a new level of consciousness. Jung continues, I had learned that the greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally insoluble, which is, as I said, old school word for unsolvable. So I'll say it again. I had learned that all the greatest and most important problems of life are fundamentally unsolvable. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. Carl Jung said, they can never be solved, but only outgrown. All the greatest and most important problems are fundamentally unsolvable. And how do they do this? From obscure possibilities either outside or inside themselves. They accepted it and grew with its help. They accepted the traumatic reality, the abusive family, the injustice, and they outgrew it. They grew with its help. They found a way that something outside of themselves or something from the inside, from experiencing that, helped them grow. If it came from outside, it became a profound inner experience. That's how I feel about what happened to me. If it came from inside, it became an outer happening. We are so greatly tempted to turn everything into a purpose and a method that I deliberately express myself in a very abstract terms to avoid prejudicing the reader one way or the other. The new thing must not be pigeonholed under any heading, for then it becomes a recipe to be used mechanically. And that's the point. Like all my work, I'm a rather technical guy, and I like clinical and precise methods and, the neuroscience and all that business. Clinical approaches, timelines. But it's not that simple. It's, Jung always says circumambulatory and circular. But trauma especially, it is called complex trauma for a reason. It is complex. It is complicated. It's not called simple trauma. It's called complex trauma. And when we turn it into a pigeonholed mechanical process, we're doomed. Now, we need the science. We need the methods. 100%. There's no way around that because it is happening in the brain. It is a body thing. It's proven. I can When you see my book, you'll see it. I've got it all there. It's black and white in your face. Jung was writing about it before he had that data, which is genius. Genius. He was solving it his way. It's insolvable. That's my own unconscious slip. But it is a problem. It is a problem, and we outgrow it. We outgrow it, even in the methods we use. I'm catching myself there. So we don't solve it with the methods. The methods we use, trauma memory processing, getting a secure base of attachment with the therapist, analysing our unconscious. We're outgrowing the trauma. That's what we're doing. It's a problem. We don't solve it. There's not one pigeonholed method. It's been everything. And especially because the body, when I say, we need to contextualize it, there's the contextualized representation in our brain. That comes from the mature parts of the brain. The sensory-based, that's from, we can feel those in the body. They're up here, but they're more primal. It's more, I associate it with the sensations I get in my legs. It's not really in the scientific literature, but in the scientific literature, the sensory-based representation might be in the basal ganglia or just the brainstem, or it's in the head, it's in the brain. It might be where it resides, but I feel that the trauma I dealt with, the responses, I focused on my legs, and I would visualize the sensory-based representation being there and going up. I know that's biologically probably incorrect, but it's not contextualized. It's not from the mature parts of the brain. That's why, somatic therapies help with that. When you just focus on the body, you have an event, a fight with your wife, a fight with a friend, and just focus on the body. You don't stay in the top. You go bottom up. That's how we contextualize things. The traumas, we access the sensory-based bottom up representation to access and contextualize it. And that's not one method. You can use some Jungian work, but Jungian work alone is not going to cover this stuff, very rarely. You need to actually process the trauma memory, specifically the flashbacks. If you don't do that, it's going to keep flashing back. So these are the ways that we start accessing the body and outgrowing it. It's not one method. It's many methods.